Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. I am Ray Valenga, president of the International Hydrofoil Society, and incidentally, the editor of the 35 videos we have posted in the last 6 weeks or so. So I'm the one who puts up the fireworks and cakes on your formal presentation. Of course, we're all serious about hydrofoils, but hey, this is a celebration. It's our 50th year. So let's have a little cake and some firecrackers. Then let's learn and enjoy from the top experts in the world. To introduce these, we have two separate speakers for today, and Vice President Mark Bibar will be doing the introduction. Let me take a second to tell you about Mark. Mark has a MS in ocean engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has a Bachelor of Science in Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering from Webb Institute. He has over 45 years of experience. Mark was the project architect and design integration manager on the Patrol Hydrofoil Missile Ship, PHM, that we'll be talking about today. He was responsible for the total ship concept and feasibility, studies, and design integration during preliminary design, contract design, and detailed design and construction. So Mark is an expert on the subject we're going to talk about today. And Mark Mandels, welcome aboard. We just phoned you to make sure you got on here. So we're all here now, and I'm going to hand it over to Mark. Thank you, gentlemen.
Hey, thanks, Rick. Okay, this is session 8. It's a panel discussion, which is, I think, the first panel discussion we will have had during the celebration. And we have 3 really great panelists today: Richard STEDD, Carl Weiskopf, and Elliot James. And the way we're going to run this is I'll give a brief introduction of all three of these guys, and then a little more detail on Richard STEDD, and he'll talk first about his experience with PGH-2s at Tucumcari. That'll be followed by Carl Weiskopf, who was a skipper of the PHM-5 USS Ares, and then finally Elliot James, who was able to rescue PHM-5 after it was taken out of service and just before it was going to be scrapped, and it has done a lot of work restoring it, and he'll talk about that as well. Starting out with Richard, his experience with the operation of the U.S. Navy Tucumcari included deployment during the Vietnam conflict and thereafter to Europe for NATO demonstrations. Carl Weiskopf, as I mentioned, was the commissioning commanding officer on PHM-5, the 5th ship of the class, and Elliot James created the USS Ares Museum. And
I'm going to go ahead and go.
Okay, thanks.
I agree.
Okay, so Richard will be our first speaker of the 3. He entered the U.S. Navy Officer Candidate School in June 1965 after graduation from John Carey University, and was commissioned as an ensign in February of 1966. Following several ship assignments, he reported in late October 1967, following orders to report to Boat Support Unit 1, Naval Special Warfare Coronado, as officer in charge of Tucumcari PGH-2. On August 1st, 1968, Tucumcari left for Vietnam. After its return to San Diego, California, Tucumcari, with Lieutenant STEDD still in command, had its home port changed to Little Creek, Virginia, the East Coast home of Naval Special Warfare. In March of '67, Richard, with his support staff and crew, left for a NATO cruise. For over 6 months, he ran Tucumcari through its paces for the navies of NATO. And just a little history, and in the beginning, PHM was envisioned to be a NATO program, and there was interest in the technology. And as we'll talk about later, PHM adopted a lot of the hydrofoil configurations embodied in Tucumcari, and so it was important for Tucumcari to do these demonstrations over in Europe. So he ran it through its paces for the navies of NATO, And on September 17th of 1967, after 33 months aboard and over 752 foil-borne hours, Lieutenant Stedd's tour came to an end. And for his service aboard Tucumcari, Richard was awarded the Navy Commendation Medal. And with that, I'll turn it over to Richard.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Mark. I didn't realize you're going to go that fast. Some of the background that I think that should be important is that one does not go from being an ensign in the fleet to lieutenant aboard a hydrofoil command. And that is that I spent 2 years aboard a minesweeper, which is considerably smaller than a destroyer. And that was the interesting thing about my short career in the Navy. My 2-year tour, or roughly 22-month tour, was aboard the USS Agile, and I spent that 2-year tour with roughly 5 officers. My commanding officer was a lieutenant commander. The executive officer was a lieutenant, and there were 3 junior officers. All of us were either ensign or junior officers, lieutenant, JG, or ensign, and I was the engineering officer, which, because I was the most junior when I came aboard, I became what's called the collateral officer. I became everything that wasn't taken care of. I was the alternate RPS custodian. I was the, let's see, what else? I was the damage control officer, the electrical officer. I was the alternative registered publications officer. Anything that wasn't taken care of, I was. So I became everything, if you get the understanding that I had to qualify to do everything. Excuse me. And indeed, I had to do just everything that the other officers had to do. I was an officer of the line. I had to become an officer of the deck underway. I had to become an officer of the deck for replenishment, officer of the deck for formation, steaming, officer of the deck for refueling, an officer of the deck for anything the captain needed. So when I came, well, and in addition to that, I became the navigator because the executive officer insisted that we learn celestial navigation and in those ancient times, Loran navigation. And for those people who understand the ancient age of Loran navigation, I had to qualify for that. And believe me, it's ancient by today's standards. We didn't have GPS. Anyway, from there I went to Mainland, where I had to work in naval intelligence, which of course is a naval intelligence. But beyond that, I was then transferred to the Tucumcari at mine warfare, or not mine warfare, excuse me, to special warfare. And when I got there, I became the officer in charge of Tucumcari, which was one of the most enjoyable parts of my short naval career. I had to be everything. I was one officer, 12 enlisted men, and when we deployed, I had a support team of anywhere from 7 to 8 additional enlisted personnel. So I had a real problem. I note that, and I'll talk about this later with Captain Weiskopf, but it was interesting that I had to take control, literally take control of up to 17 individual enlisted personnel with only one officer. And when I went through, as some of you may have seen from my representation to the Hydrofoil Society and the Hydrofoil reunion several years ago, it was quite an accomplishment to have control of 17 to 23 enlisted personnel with one officer. It was like a lion tamer in a cage. Anyway, it was a joy. I had tremendous feeling of accomplishment by doing it. I can't tell you how much personal accomplishment and joy I got from it, not because I was a lion tamer, but because it was an accomplishment that was just unbelievable. And if any of you have the time to look at my representation prior to this, please do so. It is a very short recap of my 6-month deployment, and it was unbelievable. I can't tell you how much it means to me, or meant to me at that time, and how important it was in my life afterward. I am a civilian. I've been a civilian for the last probably 45 years, but my accomplishments in the Navy have never left me, and I appreciate it, and I still love hydrofoiling, and I promote hydrofoiling. Trust me on that. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you, Martin, for the thumbs up. Appreciate that. And by the way, I wanted to say to everyone, whether you're here in Southern California, as I am delightfully, a good day and a good morning and a good afternoon. But I always want to say good day, because that's the best way to greet everyone, as I think my buddy Martin would say to most people. Take care. Thank you. Mark?
Mark, you're still muted, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about Captain Carl Weiskopf. USN retired, completed a 30-year Navy career followed by 15 years as a defense contractor with the Raytheon Corporation and Zyders Enterprises Incorporated. Carl graduated from the United States Naval Academy and was commissioned as an ensign in 1970. As a lieutenant commander, he was then the commissioning commanding officer of USS Ares PHM-5 and sailed the ship from Bremerton, Washington to Key West, Florida, followed by operations in the Caribbean. While on active duty, Captain Weiskopf earned master's degrees in computer systems management from the Naval Postgraduate School and human resource management from Chapman University. And his full bio is available on the conference website. It's quite extensive and quite an interesting career, as was Richard's, and he just described. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carl.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's a real honor to be part of this. I gave 3+ years of my life to hydrofoils, but of course I've really enjoyed even the after part of my career in being an advocate for hydrofoils The Navy's tried to follow on with the LCS program, but it seems to me, as I read more and more, that they are kind of following the same path, including now using the LCSs to do counter drug ops down in the Central America and South American ops. But it is an honor to speak with you all and be part of this, and I appreciate Mark and Martin and those in the higher ups of inviting me. I do have some slides that I want to show, and I think Martin and I have practiced this, so hopefully it won't be too painful. Am I good? Martin, give me a thumbs up. Okay, yes. So these are kind of the broad topics I was going to kind of touch on to make sure I stay on target and touch on some things that I think will be of interest to this group. I arrived in Key West on 18 September 1981 to assemble the pre-commissioning crew. To follow on to what Richard was saying, I had 4 officers, including myself. I had an XO who was a lieutenant and 2 senior lieutenant or mid-grade lieutenants on their second tour in the Navy. One is chief engineer and one is combat systems officer. And I had 2 chief petty officers. One was a gas turbine chief and one was a quartermaster chief. And I had 15 enlisted, predominantly for the pre-com crew. They were E5 and E6s. So they probably, most of them had in between 4 and 10 years on other types of ships and other Navy assignments. On 5 November 1981, I was fortunate enough to attend the christening ceremony at the Boeing facility in Renton, Washington. These are some photos of the PHMs being constructed in the facility at Boeing. Obviously, this is Taurus. I'm sorry, this is Aquila, this is Taurus, and this, I believe, was probably Aries at one point, and then, of course, followed by Gemini and Hercules. So, although I was PHM 5, I was actually the 4th ship of the class, and I'm sure Mark could go through the history of how Hercules PHM 2 ended up being the last one commissioned, but that's...
Yeah, I could talk to that later on or whatever, but it was an interesting sequence.
Right. The commissioning official was Mrs. Helen Fowler. She was the wife of Vice Admiral Earl Fowler. I'm sure Mark probably knew that gentleman. Vice Admiral Fowler was the admiral in charge of Naval Sea Systems Command, which is basically the most senior officer in the Navy, who's responsible for shipbuilding, acquisition, those sort of things. He was also, according to some reading I did on him, he was the first project manager for the PHM program when he was a more junior officer. This is a photo of Mrs. Fowler breaking the traditional champagne bottle on the Aries forward foil. In Key West, the pre-commissioning crew completed several very comprehensive courses on the unique PHM systems, because there were some systems, obviously taking an airplane and having it fly over the water. There were some aircraft systems that were used that were totally foreign to all the Navy folks. So we had a really good, and I come back to this later, but we had a really good training session for the pre-com crews. After the Christmas holiday, we all reassembled in Bremerton, Washington, which is the Navy, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, which was the Navy facility across from Seattle, where the ship would ultimately come after they finished at Boeing. During this time, I was able to embark the ship for every voyage conducted by Boeing. And I'll drop a few names, but I was lucky to have Vern Salisbury and Dick Dugan as my mentors. In addition, Bob Bateman of Boeing Marine Systems. I'm sure I'm bringing back some post-traumatic stress for Mark. Captain Bill Meyer and Commander Mike Terry provided outstanding support. On 10 May, the Navy accepted, 1982, the Navy accepted the Aries and the crew moved aboard. However, there were several critical issues that had to be resolved. The USS Taurus, PHM-3, was commissioned, from my understanding, was kind of commissioned as a political issue, even though she had outstanding deficiencies, some of it in we called it green thread with seawater piping, and some other issues that were pointed out by the Navy inspectors led by Admiral Buckley of World War II fame and PT boats. And so we were able to be delivered, but we had to go back to the Boeing facility for about 2 weeks to get some of these corrections. And it was very interesting to be holding, to have a Navy ship inside a hangar with a bunch of airplanes. I'm not sure they were 747s or what, but there were a whole bunch of airplanes being built around us. And 8 o'clock in the morning, we would sound colors, which in the Navy is traditionally when you raise the flag. And then at sunset, we would have it. And so everybody, all the sailors would stop and salute, and all the shipyard workers, all the aircraft workers weren't quite sure what was going on initially, but they caught on after a few days. But that was very unique. We did go through Lake Washington, through the locks, and down to Renton is kind of down at the bottom of Lake Washington for those that have a kind of a mind's eye of the Seattle area. It's interesting for the engineers on board. We were several times we were pulled out of the water just like we were a boat, a big boat ramp, mobile skid, a boat, lack of a better term, would come under us, and then we would just be pulled out. So it was kind of interesting. Most Navy ships, they have a dry dock, and the dry dock gets pumped out. But in this case, we were just pulled out of a boat ramp. After the maintenance period, we conducted local ops in Puget Sound with a couple of trips through the straits to Juan de Fuca, to the open ocean. It was very interesting to learn how to avoid deadheads, which I was telling folks earlier. That's a log up in the Pacific Northwest that it floats up and down, not horizontal, but it's vertical. So you only see a tip of it, and it could damage the foil and also fishing nets. I don't know of any logs that we hit, but I do know we encountered some Indian fishing nets, which created some interesting admin stuff for the admiral up there to settle, because the Indians weren't happy that we went through their fishing nets. But these things, they would have two little floats, and by the time you saw them, the foil was through them. On 23 November, we departed Bremerton for Key West. This is just a shot. I'm sure people are in this group have seen shots ad nauseum on floating on ships, but this was Aries, and I have that one tattooed on my arm. Not really, but I probably should. On 23 November, we departed Bremerton for Key West. This is a representation of our track. We made stops San Francisco and San Diego. On 11 December, we transited the Panama Canal and headed up to Key West. We arrived in Key West on the 15th of December. We were in company with, there was a real concern, and Mark probably knows more about this than I do, but there was a real concern about the hydrofoils getting outside the sight of land. I say that a little facetiously, but there was concern of us transiting by ourselves, that somehow we would sink or something. So they were going to make us wait until after Christmas. This was the next Christmas, Christmas of '82. They were going to make us wait until either PHM 6 or PHM 2 were ready, because 3 and 4 transited together, I think, with an LST being their mothership, so to speak. Not to be sexist, but that was the term we used, was mothership. So I was found out that the USS Stark, of the famous shooting later in the war, but the USS Stark was commissioning across the way over in, I guess it was Todd Shipyard, and their transit was about the same time as ours. So we politicked, and we were successful in getting the Stark to be our quote unquote mothership, so we wouldn't sink. Although most of the time we weren't around her, we were either sprinting ahead of her or floating back. But she was our assist ship and did provide fuel on our transit around. It was interesting to learn how to do an unrep at 60 feet. I think Richard will appreciate even if he didn't do any destroyer time, but refuelings and even unreps on the MSOs, you get in there about 100 and 120 feet, and the COs start to get a little pucker factor. But we had to get into about 60 from the, and we made up a little. Our fuel hose looked like it was taken from a gas station. These were things that the ships were not intended to do, but sailors being sailors, we improvised and figured out how to unrep. In note, right after we got to Key West, I in fact had flown back to El Paso to join my family and bring them from Bremerton to Key West. I got a call on Christmas Eve that the Commodore wanted me back the next day. The Soviets were making a port visit into Havana, there was an FFG out there, and the poor FFG needed some shore liberty for Christmas and New Year's, so they wanted the hydrofoils to get underway and go and sit off of Cuba, Havana, right in this area here, right in here. I couldn't make it back, obviously, but I did get back about 2 or 3 days later, and we did get underway, and we spent New Year's Eve off of Havana, watching the fireworks from Havana, but we never saw the Soviets come out. And after the FFG got their holiday leave and liberty time, they came back out, and we got to go back into port. And that was the beginning of our adventures in the Caribbean. This slide here, for those that may not be familiar with a little bit of orientation, this is Key West. And I was talking with Martin earlier this week. Yes, it's at the end of an island chain. I think it's about 100 miles, but I'm roughly up to Miami. But it sits out in the middle of the ocean. You can see the sunrise and sunset at the stand in one place, and you can see the sun come up, and you can see the sun go down. Or in the case of some of my officers, they'd see the sun come down, the sun come up in the same place. But you could do that. Very interesting place, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I talk about concerns. Some of the operations we did an Encounter X with the USS Ticonderoga, which at that time, Encounter X meaning that we were ordered to attack her. And she was transiting up to to Norfolk on her maiden voyage after she was commissioned, I think somewhere up probably Pascagoula, Mississippi or something like that. So we came out here and we were hiding around the Dry Tortugas, which are some little islands. And she was in total MCOM, which means she was not admitting anything. We were not admitting anything off of from radars or radio. And it ended up being a gun battle at about 4 miles. So we always thought it was kind of interesting, the most sophisticated ship at the time, Ticonderoga cruiser, and the fastest ship in the Navy, and we ended up being about 4 miles apart when we finally found each other, and as they say, it was a gun battle. So that was always kind of interesting. Counter drug ops became our middle name, our primary employment. I think I went back and I read some things. I think we must have done 4 or 5 on Aries. One interesting one is I got a call at 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning. We were told to get underway as soon as possible, had to recall the crew without cell phones. But I think we got all but about 2 back. And we got underway and we were vectored out to some area right over here. And there were a whole bunch of at that time, marijuana was the big one. A whole bunch of bales of marijuana floating. And we spent the next 4 hours recovering all these bales. Came back into Key West, and the Commodore wanted us to go by Mallory Square. For those of you who've been to Key West, that's the place where all that's where all the interesting people are at sunset, because they watch sunset. And he wanted us to go by Mallory Square with all these bales of drugs, marijuana on the forecastle or the fantail at sunset, which we did. And then that night, the ship was guarded by the Drug Enforcement Agency folks because they didn't offload the marijuana till the next morning. So that made it very interesting. Another one that was interesting was we were out here flying, and there's all of the islands and things out here. And we were out here looking for a high-speed cigarette boat. And we saw this radar return, and we went up and flew up to it and illuminated up on the flag. We were flying the Coast Guard flag. We illuminated and said, "We are the Coast Guard" on the USS Aries, because we had Coast Guard folks aboard. And they said, "Well, we're the Coast Guard." So they were a small Coast Guard ship that was out there looking around. They thought we were the cigarette boat because we were going so fast. So lots of interesting things that, again, drug ops became our middle name, and unfortunately it did become kind of our primary mission area. We also did some battle group ops. We worked with the Ocean Venture. We worked with the USS America. This is a picture of the USS America with Aries and Hercules, kind of little dots in the water. But it was kind of neat to watch flight ops when you could get in there and tuck up there. We also worked Unitas exercise with USS Iowa, a battleship. We did port visits to New Orleans for the World's Fair in 1984. We had numerous VIPs, including both British and German. I don't know whether the Navy was still trying to get the Germans involved, but it was fun to take them out and you know, doing a figure 5. If you visualize a 5, you can do that. I mean, figure 8s were easy. Fives were a little more with a square turn, became a little more exciting, but we could go in our wake, we could make a 5. We deployed to Honduras. Let me go back to my next slide. We deployed to Honduras and Guatemala. I say deployed. I'll talk a moment about crew endurance, but we ended up coming down here to Tala, Honduras, and somewhere in Guatemala. I think it was Santamos. But again, we pretty much, this was our backyard. This area here, and of course, right in this area became our backyard. We did go foil-borne to Gitmo, which is down here. I don't know if they show it, but Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay is down here, which is the Navy base on Cuba. So those were all interesting. We went to Nassau, Grand Cayman. Sounds like it was pleasure cruises, but and then we went up to Jacksonville and Port Everglades. So we New Orleans, as I mentioned earlier. So we kind of covered the world there. Let me talk about some operational considerations. I think this is probably some issues that we wanted to talk about. The depth of water, I know that I think Bill wrote some people have written about depth of water. Very, very critical. We drew about 24 feet when we were hull-borne. So when you're flying at 1.5 meter, water depth is not a real issue. But when you have to land, and it's only 10 feet and you're drawing 24 or so with the foil extended, becomes a nightmare. And I know that Peggy Sue, we called her Peggy Sue, Pegasus, had an issue up in Norfolk where she was in good water when she started to land, but she came down. And when you do come down, you kind of transit down and then you go hull. Same as you take off, about 22 knots, we'd say foil-borne, which is when the hull would basically lose surface effect with the water, and coming down much more gentle. But if you came down just a normal landing, you just take it off and come down. You could do crash landings, which we did with VIPs aboard because it puts water everywhere, but that brings you down to almost zero knots, no speed, almost very quickly. But again, the water was always an issue, water depth. Effects of wind in the sea with the foils retracted becomes a real issue. She's like a cork when you're floating out there and you have them retracted. So we didn't like to do that. But I remember when I came into San Diego, we had our Santa Ana winds were blowing, which is the winds that blow pretty brisk from the east. And I had a very difficult time getting alongside at port at North Island. In fact, I had to basically just tool around in the harbor for a couple hours until the winds came down a little bit. And then I had to use an aircraft carrier as my windbreak and finally had to just get in. It was tough. Couldn't really use tugs very often because tugs were bigger than the hydrofoil. So ship handling alongside, preferably it'd have your foils extended, but again, water became an issue. Fuel considerations. We carried about 16,000 gallons, but we burned about 1,000. For planning purposes, we burned about 1,000. We're on the foil. Could do 40 knots, so you could go a long ways, 400 miles in about 10 hours. But when you got there, you needed fuel. If we were on the hull, on the diesel, we'd use about 100 gallons an hour. So again, we either could go very fast or very slow, we used to say. So our way of traveling basically was a sprint and drift tactic. We'd go, the Navy required you to be within 4 hours of a certain point in the ocean, so they knew if they needed to set. Based on the USS Indianapolis, if anybody's done any reading on that, they had no idea where the ship was, and it took them like 2 days to figure out she was lost. So we would sprint about ahead, we come down on the hull, and then we would just, I won't say drift back, but we do 8 knots, and we kind of drift back. So we'd use like 12 knots, saying we're going to do 12 knots on an average, but we'd end up doing sprinting and drifting. Crew endurance. I think Mark told me, I don't know if I'd ever read this, but Mark told me the other day, 5 days was what was in the planning documents. And I can guarantee you that like on that transit, that was almost 3 weeks. And our trips to Honduras and Guatemala usually ended up being at least 3 weeks. So it became a kind of a challenge. We used to say that the 3-week quote unquote deployment was equivalent to about a 3-month deployment. Because everybody's port and starboard with the crew, meaning that they're on 8, or they're on watch, off watch, but you know, you don't get much sleep. Flying at night, I'm not sure. I've read a lot of stuff about how great the sea keeping was in sea state, but when we were in sea state 2 or above, flying at night was a challenge, depending on if you had to go in a certain direction. If you had to go into the seas, or even with the falling seas, if that forward foil got out of the water, the automatic control system said, "I don't know where I am," and it would bring the foils down, bring the forecastle down. So we had the helmsman and the guy steering the ship had to get very good about finding out how to kind of surf through the waves so that he wouldn't bring the forward foil out of the water. So again, that was mainly at night. During the day, it wasn't that big of an issue because you could sense where the waves were from. But there were some issues if you had to go in a certain direction, and you had to go A to B, and you couldn't have your choice about how you did it. It could be a challenge. Logistical support, which I guess Mark is going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but we had a 60 hertz shore power cart. The ship ran on 400 cycle. That's how it was built. So in order to plug in ashore, we had to have a cart with us, which was okay. When we did the trip to Key West, the cart came down to San Francisco, came to San Diego, but everywhere else we had to stay. We had to steam in port, which basically means that we had to keep our own electrical power generation going. Not in Key West, of course, but when we were going to Honduras, Guatemala, all these other places I talked about. So that became kind of a challenge because, again, we're burning fuel in port and putting hours on this turbine. Fendering system, Mark mentioned this the other day, and I think other people, but if you are a naval engineer, remember when the ships go alongside the pier, we had to be fendered out because with the foils retracted, and sometimes you want to do that for maintenance if you had deep enough water, but if you retracted them, the foils, if you were up against the pier, first of all, you couldn't retract. And secondly, the foils obviously would hit the pier. So we had to use some sort of fendering system, which became a challenge sometime in some of these foreign ports. In fact, in one port, we used a Honduran gunboat, and we don't have time, and I don't want to talk about it, but it became a challenge when the winds picked up. And I think Elliot knows I looked for some dents down the gunwale of the Aries when I went to see the ship in Missouri, because we kissed the gunboat on the Honduran gunboat a couple of times. BMS, Boeing Marine System Support, was a challenge. We had to have a sensor, and they had to fly it down to Honduras, or else we couldn't fly. So again, they had to go through. I had no hospital corpsman. Fortunately, I never had a major issue in the 3 years, the 2 years I was operating, but we had no medical support underway. Again, if you get into port, we could get help, but if we were out there by ourselves, and fortunately it was a consideration. We had no medical support. Supplies, I think Mark mentioned the other day when we were talking that we put supplies anywhere we could, canned goods, certainly fresh vegetables and milk, and that was, that lasted 3 to 5 days. On larger ships, generally you can unwrap for that, but we didn't have that luxury. Fresh water could become a challenge because we had our evaporators weren't that great. I know they did some upgrades, but we would actually look for water. If we could find a rain squall, we would all run up topside, literally, and take a shower. And that became a real joke when everybody's up there showering in the rain. But we did have times when we didn't have enough water for showering. I don't think the Navy supply system was ready to support the metric tools. Everything was metric. So we had metric tools. We had metric screws and everything else. You couldn't go to Ace Hardware or Home Depot, which Navy ships have done, but you couldn't go there to get spare stuff you needed because, again, it was all initially NATO and initially matrix. Ability to rearm underway. Certainly we couldn't rearm harpoons, although we had a capability of doing that in Key West, pier side, and we couldn't really rearm any ammunition. Follow-on training for the new crews after the commissioning crew. Again, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. We had a very robust training. The follow-on guys did not have that type of training, and it started to show in some of the ships. Ship's power, the SSPUs, which I know Elliot loves those, but they did our electricity, they did our start air for the gas turbine, and they did hydraulics. And I know one time I had one spoo down and I was trying to start the gas turbine. I needed the start air from the spoo, and it was only good for a couple of shots. And if that didn't work, we weren't going to start the gas turbine. Fortunately, I got started because I had a great couple of engineers in my enlisted crew. But let me finish up with a couple of things that I thought, which might be controversial, but I'll say them for this crowd. I don't think the Surface Navy knew how to employ the PHMs, particularly of the fuel consumption issues. I said the aviators, particularly like on USS America, he knew that admiral said, go out and look at something 9 miles out, let us know what it is. We'd fly out, come down on the hulls, motor in, to figure out what it was, fly back and ask for fuel. And he was no problem with it because that's how airplanes operate. If I did that with a black shoe as a surface warfare officer, commander, he would probably say, sorry, you guys, you can't keep refueling. In fact, going to the PHM was considered a little risky from a career path. A couple of flag officers, Admiral Busby, who's the head of Maritime Administration, Pete Daly, who's the head of the Naval Institute. They were all hydrofoil folks. Admiral Busby worked for me. He was my combat systems officer. But in general, it was considered as kind of a career ender, or at least a detour. I was fortunate enough to have a couple of command tours after the hydrofoil, but it certainly was a detour in a career path. And lastly, and again, Mark knows more about this than I do, I suspect. I have no idea why they chose Key West. It was fun for the crews, but it made it hard for the hydrofoils to be accepted by the rest of the Navy. You were a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And the handover to do the Coast Guard drubs ops was very easy by having the ships in Key West. But I think that, looking big picture wise, that was a tough place to put these ships and have them be accepted by the rest of the Navy. Is not, we always, joked about being Hogan's Navy McHale's Navy, being McHale's Navy because we were down in Key West and, there was no admiral around and, that sort of thing, which that's good. It was fun. It made life easy. You could go to Sloppy Joe's, you could go out on Duval Street, etc. But I think acceptance by the big Navy was tough. So that's all I've got. I'm sure it's a little bit longer than expected, but like I say, I could tell sea stories all day about the hydrofoils. And again, I think from an engineering standpoint, they were perfect. But I just think the Navy wasn't ready for them. Not sure the Navy's ready for them today when you keep looking at the big and better stuff that they're trying to build. Even, talking about this new FFG, it's going to end up being much bigger, I think, by the time they end up. And now I got to figure out how to get out of my slides.
Thanks, Carl. That was an excellent overview. I learned some things. I hadn't heard about the, difficulties operating foil board at night.